So it's indeed my privilege to have this kick-starting of the 17th Annual Public Policy Conference by this panel discussion on Professor Govinda Rao's book, Studies in Indian Public Finance, probably a culmination of your life's work. We've had, along with Professor Rao, two other eminent panelists who are going to discuss this book. And I'll just do a very brief introduction of the three members, because I'm sure you all know everything that is to be known. But so Professor Govinda Rao is our CPP, is on our advisory board, and his past positions include member 14 Finance Commission. He was the director of NIPFP and ISEC, two eminent public finance bodies in India. And also he was member of several Government of India expert committees and study groups dealing with taxation and public expenditure. Then we have Professor Vinod Vyasulu, who is also an ex-colleague. He was the RBI chair at ISEC and mostly known for being associated with CBPS, which is the Center for Budget and Policy Studies. He says he left Sonipat and came to Bangalore because of health issues, and I'm sure Sonipat's loss is Bangalore's gain. And then we have and then we have Professor Bhanumurthy, who is the first Vice Chancellor of Babasaheb Ambedkar School of Economics University, the base university. He's had several stints with UN organizations and Government of India committees and study groups. His field of interest is macro and monetary economics. Now, Sriram had asked me to kind of, give a very broad structure for this panel discussion. And I said I really wanted to be conversationalist because I'm sure the three of you all know each other pretty well. But because I am the moderator and I have to give the structure. So the way I had written to them was that I wanted Professor Govinda Rao to actually talk to us about his journey, not just writing of this book, but his journey from Udupi. And spend some time telling us about what it was being an academician in those days, being an economist in those days. And then also then coming to public finance, we would like to know what really you think differentiates public economics or public finance from the more mainstream neoclassical economics as we study it today. That apart, also, how has the trend, research trend and academic trend in this subject changed over the last 30, 40 years? You've seen it all. So if you could spend some 12 to 15 minutes talking on that, then I will ask Professor Vinod Vyasulu and Bhanumurthy to talk about the book specifically. The way I see it, the book actually is divided very neatly into 4 parts. The first 2 parts really deal with the budget, 2 sides of the budget: taxation, revenues, and expenditures. I'm hoping Professor Vinod Vyasulu will kind of deal with these 2 sides of the budget. And then the third part is really balancing the budget, where you talk of deficits and debt, and the macroeconomic implications of it. And of course, the biggest thing that is not often talked about when we talk of Indian public finances, which is really the role of the states and the intergovernmental transfers. And I would want Professor Bhanumurthy to really talk on the later 2 topics discussed in the book. The timing, I've been told we can go on till about 8 o'clock, right? I'm hoping we kind of take an hour for this discussion, and if there are questions from the audience, we'll take that up. Before I forget, I think Sriram has asked me to also put on record the role played by our sponsors, Bank of Baroda and NABARD, and we thank them for sponsoring the event as always. Over to you, Professor Rao.
In fact, this is there are about 16 or 17 books that have come out of me, but I've never liked to make a presentation on the book. I think the most well-known book that came out was with Nirvikar Singh on political economy of federalism in India. And so much of my work has been on federalism. But this is something, as a director of National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, I started a course for university teachers during summer vacations, because public finance is a subject which is not taught properly. And we thought at least we'll give them a bird's eye view, a glimpse of what the public finance is like. And I selected something like 9 people from east, west, south and north, and got a complex set of people. And that was a good success, but unfortunately, like most of the things, when I left, that also left. And I don't think they do it again. They will have to revive it again. Hopefully they will do it. how come I became an economist in the first place and got into public finance in the next? You know, after I finished my pre-university in physics, chemistry, mathematics, I was admitted to the BSc course. But then before getting admitted, I had to get a signature of the head of the Department of Physics. That man was a terror. Now, he saw that marks were all right, the college has given the admission, but that fellow said, why do you want to study physics? You should go and study some economics or sociology or political science or something like that. Now I said, you know, I can go and beg, and basically he wanted me to beg him and do the things, the typical feudal style. But then my problem was that if I did that, I would get the admission, but then I have to put up with this fellow for another 3 years. So I didn't want to do it. So I took it seriously. I went to the head of the department of economics and told him that I want to study economics. He said, why? You have such good marks in physics. Why are you doing this? So, but then I said I couldn't care less because I am not worried about what happens tomorrow. Today I want to join BA. That's what it. So that's how I got into economics. And once I finished my BA, see, there was no university close by. You know, it was Udupi. Now they have Mangalore, but those days, my father said, I can't afford to send you to any different place. It's for you to decide wherever. You write to your brother, he said. So my brother was a professor at the Physical Research Laboratory in Ahmedabad. So I wrote to him, he said, come over. Now, that was the easy part. But when I went there, I found out that they were all teaching economics in Gujarati. They had what is called the Mangni Rekha. and it's a Gujarati, the place at that time, even English language was taught in Gujarati. Now, that is the system. But then I had to request the professor there that I don't understand even Hindi, forget about Gujarati. Please allow me not to come to the class. I'll sit in the library and read. And then once in a while I'll meet the teachers and learn. So in that sense, I'm a self-taught economics guy. And it so happened that in the second year when I was doing MSc, Professor Lakdawala happened to come there as a director of Sardar Patel Institute. And he was also visiting professor at So I used to attend the class, and that was a very refreshing thing. And he said, after the exams are over, come and see me. I didn't realize when he said, come and see me, I should go to the institute. I went to his house. No, I was naive. Let us understand that. Coming from a rural background, I was not smart at all. I was very naive. So I went to his house. He said, all right, you come to the office. So I was interviewed by Yogendra Alak, T.S. Popola, K.K. Subramanian, and I don't know, I didn't even know that it was an interview. They were talking and I was talking. Then Lakdawala called me and said that, see, we will give you a research assistant job. But then I haven't completed my MA. He said, doesn't matter whether you complete or not, we will take you. So anyway, I went home for vacation, and then they called me and then joined. And there I happened to meet, my first job was to work with Lakdawala, and there was another K.V. Nambiar. And that work was on commodity taxation in India. That's how I started research. And where Lakdawala praises me for, in a paragraph, for doing all sorts of things. But anyway, and then later, I was working with a person called Shiv Shankar Gupta, who actually was the second deputy director of the institute. He had done his public finance PhD in PhD in York University with Alan Peacock and Jack Weisman, two of the best public finance specialists. And we were working together. He immensely liked me, and we did a lot of work. And then what happened is that there was some problem, internal problem. He resigned and went to Sambalpur. And then he went on, every 3 months he would come and then persuade me, you come here, come here. In the meantime, Lakdawala said, you come to Bombay. So again, naive, I decided to go to Sambalpur. And went to Sambalpur and realized that there was no library there. Then I was traveling all over the place to find a place, the first thing to get all the literature that is required for the thing. But one great thing is the rigorous public finance Shiv Shankar Gupta had. And it was really out of the world. I don't think anybody even today has the type of understanding of public finance. And that's the time when quite a few, good people came. But he vanished over a period of time. He was sucked into the politics of that place. But after PhD, I left and then came. And then, of course, I had also come here, but I will not talk much about that. Then what happened is that there were a series of articles which I wrote. And Chile was starting National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. And he called me. And, I went as a young man, the assistant professor. In 8 years' time, I had become a professor. And that's how the rest of it basically was. It's basically you work and you do your work, and if you do your work, you get your rewards. That's basically the thing. Anyway, that's how I became. Later, when I came here as a director, Chile would not keep me here. He would want me back at NIPAP, and when I went and joined, he said, Govind, now for 10 years I don't have a problem, you look after the place. That's the way it was. We had a very tremendously great relationship, in that sense of the term. Of course, he was very meticulous. Once he said, you can write well, and I will correct your English, not economics, and he would do that. But anyway, on the question of evolution of public finance, you see, I don't think one of us follows a particular, paradigm in that sense of the term. And basically, you start with the neoclassical economics. Rationality and, basically supply-demand issues are important. But at the same time, institutions matter. It is not that you ignore the institutions, you do ignore the political economy issues. Institutions matter. We go back and forth. In fact, there are times the classical economics returns to the whole sort of discussion, particularly in the public debt, for example. When classical said that public debt has a burden on the future generation, there is no difference between public and private debt. And, basically there is intergenerational equity, and then there is no difference between internal and external debt. These are the three propositions. And this is what classical said. And after Abba Lerner, the follower of Keynes, came in, they said there is nothing like that, because there is no burden on the future generation. When the government issues a public debt, basically people subscribe to it. It's a voluntary investment option that they have. So they take it. So there is no the burden involved at that time. When it is returned, when it matures, it has to be paid. And again, there is no burden because it's an exchange between the taxpayers and the bondholders. There is no... So, it's a very convincing argument at that time. Right at that time, this fellow comes, Buchanan comes and says, there is something called an opportunity cost. Now, the money that you spend, initial money that you take away, after all total pool is given, you take that money away, there is an opportunity cost of that. At the end of the time, if you by making, the money prudently and investing that money prudently, the economy can get, much higher rate of return, which would help in servicing the debt and repaying the debt. And to the extent that the government debt doesn't yield the rate of return of alternative use or the opportunity cost, the burden will have to be borne by the future generation. And obviously there is no difference between internal and external debt. All debt has to be repaid. Of course, he was talking about not talking about the economy with sort of exchange, so free exchange rate sort of an economy. And then of course there is no difference between public and private debt. Now, then he says, after discussion he says, after all, it's the classicals which were characterized as vulgar opinion on debt. The neoclassicals called it a vulgar opinion on debt, and he calls their opinion as new orthodoxy. So he says, when all is said and done, it is the vulgar opinion that is really true. That's how. Now that's an example of how things move. Basically, there is a lot of thing that has gone on. For example, in the evolution, I will take another couple of minutes. In the evolution, the role of the state. Ultimately, when you talk about the public finance, what is it that the state is supposed to do? What is it? And within the role of the state, you need to see, what type of an intervention is required. When the markets fails, the state comes in. State has to intervene. There are only certain types of market failure where the government has to really spend money, whether it is provision of public goods or very high externalities, and if it is peculiar type of externality, it may be, sort of a tax transfer program, this is a subsidy program. So, other interventions are regulatory. In other words, if you want the market to function well, or market, you need to have a competitive market, what you have to do is regulatory. And then saying that the markets don't function and I will take over. And once you take over, and they say that since we own it, we don't need to regulate it. We'll end up with the situation where we had in the banking sector recently. Now, obviously, regulation is an important issue, but that doesn't directly impact the public finance part of it, only the spending part. Similarly, on the issue of equity, I will only give 2 or 3 examples. The rest of it, the others will do. Now, there has been a lot of discussion on, you need to have progressive taxes, etc., etc. I mean, top 1% of the population has 32% of the wealth, according to the World Inequality Report. Top 10% of the people have more than, something like 57% of the wealth, and bottom 50% of the people have 13% of the wealth. I mean, that's the way they say. Yes, inequality is important, but can the tax policy deal with that? Can reducing the incomes of the rich increase the incomes of the poor? Ultimately, the size of the cake, that is important. So if you say, because you see, capital embodied labor is highly mobile, and it's extremely difficult to catch it. In this country, 6% of the people actually are registered for income tax. What equity are we going to talk about the 6% of this? So if you are talking about, increase in the incomes of the poor, obviously market fails to redistribute. One of the important failures in market failures is the redistribution, which doesn't do. And therefore, the redistribution to the really needy, that comes in the expenditure side of the budget. All the time we talk about, you reduce the corporation tax, now what will happen? Sort of as if the ceteris paribus assumption is that if you don't, if you at that high level corporate taxation, they will continue to exist. I mean, they would have options. They would move. Now, so there are issues. There has been a change in the focus in terms of poverty elevation, which comes to the expenditure side of the budget, rather than trying to do minute changes in the income distribution there. So the tax policy is required to be broaden the base, reduce the rate differences, and have simple and transparent tax system. From there, that is my good friend Richard Byrd used to call it BBLR approach, broad-based low-rate approach. Similarly, one of the important things that they do is to have a goods and services tax or the value-added tax, or all over this thing, because there you don't and again, most of the time they are talking about 1 rate or maximum 2 rates, not 6 rates, not 4 rates, and the ultimate sort of umpteen number of other rates. But anyway, these are some of the things that have evolved over a period of time. And not everybody agrees with this type of a thing, and I very well understand. But the basic point is that if you are not dogmatic and willing to look at the incentive structure, I mean, I think that's what I'm trying to do in this, because redistribution is important, and obviously that has to be done. Substantial part of it has to be done by the expenditure side of the budget. Thank you. I will stop it here.
What I remember of this campus has nothing to do with the reality today. I remember a dusty, half-built buildings, and I remember a headline in Deccan Herald once where blocks D&D were pictured and said, this is the Institute of Indian Management, where there are 3 floors, but there are no staircase to go up. So it's a very different world from what happens here. But it was also in this world that I met Govind for the first time. In case you're wondering, it's the last century. So that sort of gives you a sense of time. I was just checking with him whether 77 or 78, I'm not sure.
77.
77. It's a long time.
September.
It's a long time. So anyway, after that, we sort of run into each other in various situations. I'll come to the book. It was a pleasure reading the book. There are here and there minor typos, which your typesetter or copywriter or somebody.
Being printed again.
With corrections. That's excellent. Because they are very annoying when you're reading it and then suddenly you have to read a sentence 3 times. Because I'm not sure I remember now, but I remember one case where I wrote a book review and said this is a lucid book. But they printed it's a lurid book. So these kind of things do happen. I like the book because first there are not too many books that deal with the kind of issues of Indian public finance. It's one of the lacunae in a lot of our courses that we don't talk enough about our own country, the data systems, the institution structure, and so on. You know, in many cases, many of our universities, we have one course called Indian economy, and it's done. And when I went to the US, I said, why don't they have a course on American economy? And then I found every course was about the American economy. They didn't need it. But here we should do that because at least during the times I was teaching, there's a lot of textbooks and so on tell us about the American economy, the Fed, this and that, but not enough. And this book is a good corrective. It tells you about our systems, context in which it grew, and so on. It has traced the evolution of public finance. There's a very interesting history of the early years and the public sector orientation and what happened. Now, I'm one of those who seem to think that the initial years with the public sector, when you look back on it, did make a contribution, but the policy structure around it lasted too long. R.K. Hazari pointed out around 1967 that licensing had run its course and it should go, but it went on well into the 70s. And finally, it was 91 when the structure was changed. But nowadays, when it is said that there was nothing good that happened and things were wrong, it is important to know that the industrial backbone and base was built, you know, if you look at Steel Authority of India, BHEL, HAL, a whole series of these where the basic technological capacity with all the constraints that we faced were built. And I also happen to think it was a bit of an advantage to us that we were seen as a friend of the then Soviet Union, and therefore access to technology was not easy to get, which forced many companies to do a lot of indigenous work. And the best example of this perhaps is the space program where his brother made important contributions, because a lot of indigenous developments took place. And so I think that when you're forced to rely on yourself and do something, the necessary and it comes in. So yes, it's important to be open and to be part of the world. There's no argument for autarky, but it doesn't mean that everything is open. Now, what form of controls, what you protect, and infant industry argument is fine, but infants grow up. So there are a lot of judgmental issues that come up. And I think in many of the cases in what we did, the response was a little late. The Chinese took off by 1980 or so, It took us more than 10 years to sort of make some of these changes. But at the same time, what are the changes we make? What is your belief in the market? Govinda has pointed out that the market talks of allocative efficiencies, but it does nothing on redistribution. Now, redistribution is very important in a country like ours where there are both economic inequalities and social inequity. It's a reality. And you said 6% are registered for income tax, but how many actually pay tax? 3%?
No, 6% is the.
They file.
File that.
But who actually pay 1 rupee or more?
Yeah, maybe.
It's a much smaller, because you have to file if you have got a salaried job. So he is right. On that 6%, you cannot talk about redistribution. But at the same time, the other question comes up is, they're capable of paying, how much can you milk them for government revenues? So that's one side of the question. The other side of the question is what he said, that the expenditure side matters. Now, here, there's a difference from commercial accounting and commercial firms. Parties fight elections, some party gets elected, they made promises, and from the promises, they make a list of things they want to do. And for doing what they promised to do, you have estimates of how much money they need. So the government fisc starts with the idea of, I want to spend so much. And the question then comes up of how you raise the money, how much of it through taxation, borrowing, maybe from abroad, whatever the sources. So unlike, say, private companies, where they say, look, we put together 1 lakh of rupees, this is the capital, and how can we deploy it to make a profit? So they're two very different. So we start with expenditures. Now, when it comes to expenditures, there's a very detailed discussion of expenditures. Money comes from Delhi, from the states. He points out that probably between 2/3 and 3/4 of the expenditure in India is at the level of the states and even below the states. But the powers of taxation are largely with the union. So that itself brings about a whole lot of issues discussed in detail in this book. But when you want to spend money, how does the money flow? There's again a discussion, the various forms, grants that are given, specific purpose grants, and so on. I just want to talk about the oft-stated statement which every minister in the state makes in every state, that you want to do this, but we don't have the money. Now, if you look at local accounts, we've done a lot of work at the district and below. When I started working, I was surprised to find there are no accounts at the district level and below. There's what you call approved expenditures, there are vouchers. So it's a laborious task in trying to construct even a basic set of accounts. Now, of course, there are systems. The CAG has worked out a system of accounting that has been implemented. Things are a lot better now. But one of the interesting things that you find when you look at, and this is in districts across very many states, that when it comes to a large number of items, there is this thing called the unspent balance. There would be money left over, 10 crores allocated to a district for health. They spent 6, 4 is unspent balance. So the statement that there isn't enough money is not quite true. What this tells us is there's this lack of capacity to spend properly, even the existing amounts of money. But this also goes together with a larger statement that the deficits are growing up at the Government of India level. And a lot of this has to do with the nature of transactions and how they're accounted for. When there is an unspent balance in the district, in the health department, that comes in to the state level as savings in the health department, reduces the fiscal deficit. People are happy because you want to reduce. But what about the impacts of this? So one of the most important things we have to do is to look at the institutional structures pointed out in the book. And in a federal country like this, you have to see how these are best done. Now, apart from the union, there are only 2 levels that are truly government. If one of the definitions of government is the power to tax, that is, it's a coercive power. Union government has it, the states have it. But then municipalities and gram panchayats also have it. They can tax property, etc., etc. District panchayats don't, taluk panchayats don't. So in this particular setup, how is it to work? Now, one of the points I've always wondered, and this doesn't require legal changes or constitutional amendments, there's a budget session in every state. In fact, the BBMP here in Bangalore sends a budget to the government. But until the government, Urban Development Department approves it, they cannot spend anything. The question I have is, in a Gram Panchayat, when there is so much money for, say, schools, why should it be decided by the state level education? The money has gone to the district, there is money to build 2 schools. Why don't you let the local panchayats decide where those schools should be? Why is that imposed? And if in some particular department they say, we don't need a school, but we need a compound wall or toilets or something, they should have that freedom doesn't exist. So these are the small kind of changes that are required so that the money that is available is properly spent. We then come to the other question of, is there enough money being spent? Again, the book points out that the amounts that we spend on education and health are woefully inadequate. For many years, the health expenditure was below 1%. It's now reached 1.2, 1.3, where it's around that. But that is woefully inadequate for a country of this size. And it is at the same time, you have the other thing, that around 75% of expenditure on health is out-of-pocket expenditure. In other words, people are paying for it outside of the fiscal regime. So clearly more has to be spent. At some point, that means government has to get revenue from wherever it gets, whether it's the state or it's the union. And here this question that we raised of how much tax. Yes, you cannot use taxes to redistribute income. But taxes are a source of revenue for the government, and it is important to use that optimally to the extent possible. What is that particular rate? I think this is not something that we've sorted out. For example, I'm a critic of the fact that recently the corporate tax was brought down. At a time when the economy was already slowing down and just before COVID hit, and a time when government needed to spend money. How much is the tax? Low tax is fine, but what is that low tax? I think we have to do a lot of research in order to find this out. I'm not an advocate of what we once had in this country, 98% under Indira Gandhi.
97.7 plus
Surcharge.
Including surcharge, plus the wealth tax.
Which would cross 100. That was and I think Chidambaram became a hero with his dream budget when he brought it down to 68%.
In fact, it was brought down by the Jalaya Committee report, but then he rationalized
Yeah,
it
he
into
was
3 rates.
he was the FM who.
10, 20, 30.
Yeah. And our very own Devagowda was the PM at that time.
Yes.
So that's fine. Is 2030 right or should be 35? I leave that question open. More than that, is there a justification for separating corporate tax and income tax? Income is income. There's a discussion about whether capital gains should be treated separately from income. Capital gains are also income, they're called unearned income. One argument is that if you tax them, there's an incentive effect, which is negative. Now, empirically, has that worked out? I don't know. I have not seen conclusive evidence on this matter. Now, you often hear that we need more, but the government lacks political will. And in my view, I think it's different. The government is elected, it has a majority. This government has certainly got a majority. So I think there is political will that this is all we want. We don't want to collect anymore. So I flip the question from they have the political will, this is what they want. If you want to do other things, find other ways of doing it. So I've talked something about the expenditure side, something about the ways of raising revenue. These are some of the problems that we have. The other question I leave to Bhanumurthy would be this entire question of intergovernmental transfers, which is part of fiscal federalism. Any federal system requires constant consultation, collaboration, dialogue, compromise across various levels of government. And this means also the state and the local bodies. Our local body is government. In our country, the term used is institutions of self-governance. Now that's very interesting, but where did this word come from? Because we are unique in using this word, institutions of. I found that it was first used in the Royal Commission on Decentralization, 1907, before we met. So 1907, at that time, the British wanted to set up a local system to help the collector. The title of the office, collector, tells you what it was doing. And one Englishman would find it difficult. So you brought in institution of local self, where some of the local influential landlords, gundas, moneylenders were brought in, and they were told that you help us collect a certain amount of money, and that explains the chaos in land records and all other things that happen. So that was what an institution, it was not democratically elected. But after the we still retain that term. Whereas I think that it will only make sense when they are government. So why can't it be, Rampura Sarkara? Even the term panchayat, going back in history to all it done, is a bit misleading. So I think we have a long way to go. And I stop at this point and see what you have to say on fiscal federalism. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So Professor Govinda Rao, Professor Vinod Vyasulu, Professor Kamath, Professor Sriram and others. First of all, let me thank IMM for inviting me to this panel discussion. I have known Professor Govinda Rao for almost 24 years now, first as a PhD student and then later as a colleague at NIPFP. Now I started as a student of Professor Govinda Rao, and I'm sure all of you know, as students we're always scared of teachers, and that time he was a director. That fear started in 1998. Even now I still have that fear. So after so many years. So what I did was, to be safe, I typed myself what I'm going to speak today so that I'll not fumble. And Professor Vyasulu, again, I missed working with him. I joined in 1996, Isaac. Just before that, he left Isaac and
95 and
yes. So they were told that I should be working under you when I got the fellowship.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, then but I've been admiring his work and the center that he started. In fact, first time I realized that Delhi has a location advantage. To get this book, almost I took 15 days. And it's not available in Bangalore, so then suddenly on Friday I could get hold of it through DHL. So the two topics that Professor Kamath has given me, I tried to go through that whole 2 chapters, and then I thought, let me save my own views on those subjects. I'm also privileged that I worked in 2 institutions where he was the director. In fact, Dr. Rao is known for repairing these 2 institutions. Both were in a bad shape, and in fact, he brought these 2 institutions to the national stage, and I was fortunate to be part of those 2 institutions. So it's a privilege to be part of this panel discussion on Professor Govinda Rao's new book on studies in Indian public finance. Dr. Rao has been one of the foremost leading experts in the fiscal policy studies in India. During his 5 decades long career, Dr. Rao has contributed immensely in each and every sub-themes of Indian public finance research as well as policy. This book is an outcome of his recent writings on the themes such as public expenditures, government revenues, macro fiscal frameworks, intergovernmental fiscal transfers, fiscal federalism, and so on. But this is a very small part of the huge contributions Dr. Rao has made to this Indian public finance literature. Indeed, if one brings out his collected essays as edited volumes, there could be at least a dozen volumes could be brought out, and many of them are still have contemporary relevance. Dr. Rao's contribution do not limit to research and research writings. As he mentions in this preface, Dr. Rao worked hard to build research capacity in the country by introducing summer refresher course in public finance and personally supervising. And we all know how personally he was involved. He used to be part of the presentations also at the end. And it became so popular, the Reserve Bank of India has asked IGIDR to have a similar program for RBI staff at IGIDR. So I think that is the huge contribution that he has done for building capacity in this country. He also guided, encouraged, and mentored many scholars to take up fiscal policy studies, and I happen to be one of the beneficiaries of Dr. Rao. Before I joined NIPFP, I was not exposed to fiscal policy at all. Like any of the master students in India, we don't study much of public finance. But so before I joined NIPFP, I didn't know much of public finance. He has introduced me to macro fiscal analysis, and the outcomes of those analyses was used for public policy such as successive finance commissions, FRBM roadmap, fiscal monetary coordination, and undertaking simulations for 12th five-year plans. Even in the macro models, a fiscal block used to be a very small block, but after I joined NIPFP, we had a very significant role for the fiscal policy. And at the same time, in 2011, Dr. Rao suggested me that I should do some work on fiscal multipliers. And fortunately, we could do that by 2012. After 10 years, we were pleasantly surprised that that work became a basis for post-COVID union budgets that we had for the last 2 years, where the government adopted the strategy of focusing on capital expenditures to revive the economy. So this is completely based on that particular study which Dr. Rao has suggested in 2012. Many of us are really grateful to Dr. Rao and his mentorship. However, whatever we do, some of the mistakes that we do should not be attributed to Professor Rao. He has just completed 75 years, and we wish him many more productive years. And we also have an event in Trivandrum next week where we are going to celebrate Rao at 75. And perhaps, in my view, after Dr. Rangarajan, Dr. Rao is the most prolific writer at this age, and we pray that he continue to write and guide the country for many more years to come. As I said earlier, this book is a small part of the contributions of Dr. Rao, and I was asked by Professor Kamath to focus on two aspects of that book, that is debt and deficits and fiscal federalism. So let me come to the first topic, that is debt and deficits. The targeting debt and deficits have become the most important issues in the post-reform fiscal policy in India. It has so much of theoretical foundations as well as equally empirical literature. Dr. Rao very eloquently reviews both the aspects in chapter 6. The chapter neatly brings out the linkage between debt stock and deficit flows and the conditions under which the debt levels could be reduced. He argues that there is a need for counter-cyclical policies to ensure debt stability. Indeed, he takes the help of famous statement of Martin Feldstein that he made in 2004 in RBI, and it starts at saying fiscal deficits are like obesity, and I think there is a big paragraph on that. Those who want, they should read that. By using this statement, Dr. Rao mentions 4 reasons why the governments should be watchful of fiscal deficits in page 125. Fiscal deficit adds to debt, increase in interest burden, crowds out private productive expenditures, lead to financial crowd of private investments, and monetization of fiscal deficit lead to inflationary pressure, and it's also risks of losing credit ratings. He gives examples from India for all the 4 issues and suggests that 1991 crisis was due to negligence of some of these reasons. And he explains similar experiences during early 2000s, where fiscal deficit went back to double digits. And the chapter also brings out how the FRBM Act is enacted, the background as well as its success. Dr. Rao suggests that while FRBM has brought in some discipline, it was only short-lived. The chapter also explains how the 3% target is fixed. Indeed, I am glad that the chapter do not refer to Maastricht Treaty, because in Delhi, many people think that 3% has been imported from Maastricht Treaty, but it has a basis. And I'm told there was also a nice story behind this. whether there should be a numerical target to be fixed or to be left to the governments. The E.S. Sharma committee, where Dr. Y.V. Reddy and Ashok Lahari were members, in the deliberations, Dr. Reddy felt that there is a need for nominal limit for fiscal deficit. What is even more important is the mode of financing the fiscal deficit and the use that the resources so raised are put to. I think this particular point is actually coming back after 20 years, which becomes very relevant for us. Later, it was in the 12th Finance Commission that gave the justification for 3% and added as part of their recommendation. In fact, we are eternally thankful to Dr. Rangarajan for bringing these kind of issues. Not only this, in fact, dismantling the automatic monetization as well. The chapter also explains further developments on the FRBM in the successive finance commissions. However, I thought there is a small missing link. Between the 13th and 14th finance commissions, there was another committee headed by Dr. Kelkar in 2012 to redraw the FRBM for next 5 years up to 2016-17, and this was as it is retained by the 14th Finance Commission, for which Dr. Rao was a member, and mostly continued the 2016-17 numbers for the rest of the 14th Finance Commission period. One issue here is the 14th Finance Commission could not endogenize the 7th Pay Commission impact. As we all know, that Pay Commission impact on fiscal variables are so huge, and hence the encasing committee was asked to relook at the 14th Finance Commission recommendation. For a question why the 14th Finance Commission did not consider the impact of 7th Pay Commission, we were told that Finance Commission did not want to preempt the Pay Commission recommendations, and then that's the reason they did not really include in that. Be that as may, the 14th Finance Commission recommendations, in which Dr. Rao was a member, has made a great contributions in balancing the union and states' fiscal relations. Now, the encasing committee, which came in 2016, also ignores another anticipated expenditures due to sustainable development goals, especially at the state level. As we know that SDGs were supposed to be implemented at states, but when they worked out the public debt levels for the state governments, they fixed it at 20%, and they don't really consider the SDG expenditures, which was supposed to be very huge. They were only suggesting glide paths. In fact, that was the time my monetary policy was also talking about glide paths. Now, they also imitated in the FRBM Act the glide paths. Again, the encasing committee recommendations were very short-lived. As Dr. Rao mentions in the chapter, there are many unanticipated risks for the FRBM roadmaps. In this context, some of us were suggesting for a flexible fiscal deficit targets. Indeed, it could have been more appropriate, especially when we have a flexible inflation targeting. I'm not sure whether flexible inflation targeting regime consistent with the fixed FRBM targets. I'm also aware Dr. Rao's position on this aspect, but I thought I highlight this issue for the benefit of the audience here. Now, on the FRBM Act, we have come to a situation, there is a dilution of the Act with revenue deficit target no more a part of the, for the FRBM Act, thus risking the quality of government expenditures. Indeed, our work for the 15th Finance Commission showed that the dilution of the FRBM Act could risk the GDP growth of the country by at least 1.5 percentage point on an average for the 15th Finance Commission period. And thus resulting to widening of the public debt rather than declining. Dr. Rao also explains how fiscal deficit, revenue deficit, and public debt are related and are linked to the growth prospects as well. Here, one aspect I thought to draw the attention of everyone is, in India, we have 3 definitions of public debt and comes from same sources, but we have 3 different numbers. And I think this has to be really addressed. In fact, we have an Indian Public Finance Statistics. There is a government debt paper that comes from the Ministry of Finance, and then there is an RBI data. But you have 3 different numbers floating around, and we don't know what is to be targeted. In fact, yesterday, okay, let me come to that a little later. With respect to the success of FRBM Acts, Dr. Rao highlights this in page 138. why FRBM is only successful in the initial stages and not in the later period. There he also brings out the issue of not accounting for contingent liabilities, the difference between the public debt and liabilities actually widening over the period, and the role of weakening fiscal marksmanship. He highlights why the FRBM, we could not achieve the FRBM targets. Perhaps we may need to ask a question whether we should continue to have the FRBM Act. More than fiscal deficit, revenue deficit, in our view, it is important to target the public debt. We have suggested to the 14th Finance Commission that FRBM may be renamed as the Debt Sustainability and Budget Management Act, and indeed the Finance Commission include this as one of the recommendations, and this was reiterated by the 14th Finance Commission, but still not been accepted by the Ministry of Finance. Here I think it's very important for all of us. We do have a lot of dashboards in the CM dashboard, PM dashboard. In fact, we were suggesting there should be a dashboard for saying that how much we owe as part of the public debt, each and every state, so that it should be there in front of the Chief Minister or the Prime Minister, so that we'll know how much we owe to the future generation. Dr. Rao talks about freebies. Right now there is so much discussion about freebies. He talks about freebies much before the current debate. In fact, it is in page 142, although he doesn't use the word freebies. For this, he suggests for a very strong independent fiscal institutions and devotes a whole section on that where we need to have a very strong fiscal institution. Successful finance commissions have suggested for having such institutions, and it's important to look at what 14th Finance Commission has suggested, and actually Dr. Rao says the suggestions of the 14th Finance Commission was much better than the suggestion of the 15th Finance Commission. Here I must also refer to Dr. Rao's earlier work on estimating implicit subsidies. That was a pioneering work which gave a conceptual framework to understand the kind of discussion that's happening right now on the freebies. Somewhere I get a feeling that many important recommendations of the 14th Finance Commission seems to have been diluted by the 15th Finance Commission. And I talked about the Fiscal Council, and in fact, for the first time, one of the Finance Commission was asked to relook at the recommendation of the previous Finance Commission, the devolution package itself, that 42%. It has become part of the terms of reference, and we all know what happened about the controversy in terms of using the population data. So I'll stop here, but on the fiscal federalism, I don't have much understanding, but I thought let me go through the chapters basically to understand myself. The book reviews the chronology of developments in India on the fiscal federalism. Indeed, Dr. Rao highlights 5 developments and expresses his anguish that Indian federalism needs much more to succeed in its objectives. He highlights 5 developments, and it's there in the book in page number 173. One major view is that the Indian federalism failed to decentralize below the state level. I think in many places this particular statement comes up in the chapter. Here he also brings out the role of Niti Aayog, but I personally felt that Dr. Rao was holding his views on Niti Aayog in the book. And we all know what Niti Aayog is doing. There's so much of index, and every day they produce a lot of index. I don't know what else is happening in Niti Aayog. There is also a discussion on GST Council. However, it's not very clear what his views on 14% assured revenues, which some of us felt as GST's birth defect. That is one of the reasons why we are not able to see whether the government is going to continue this compensation. In summary, I can only say that this book discusses a range of developments in Indian public finance in the last 5 decades, during which period, perhaps after Dr. Chellaya, Dr. Rao has been at the center of these developments. And as Dr. Rao himself says in his preface, in fact I quote, "When you come to the end of a venture, you feel that much more remains to be done, and I alone am responsible for this feeling." So we wish that Dr. Rao, with his writings, continue to guide the public policy making in this country.
Okay, these are for purposes of discussion. One of the points you make in the book is that it is the duty of the government to protect property rights. Now, I would have thought the first duty of the government is to protect personal liberty, not to get arbitrarily arrested, etc. But I don't think he's against that. He's talking as an economist. But property is a very broad term. What exactly is property rights? Then there are many rights around it. If you take land, there is the right to use land to grow crops. There is the right to take out minerals from it, right to inherit, right to sell. There are a whole lot of rights. And the property rights is a kind of bundle that seems to encompass all of it and saying when you protect property rights. But I think it is a difficult concept to use when you have, for example, common pool resources, cooperatives, where the nature of ownership is quite different. And just with Elena Ostrom on some of these issues. So, should we be more nuanced and use a more specific term, like protect ownership rights, rights to inherit, rights to pollute, whatever it might be. So that's one, it's a more nuanced issue. The second thing was the objective of fiscal policy is growth, the size of the cake. Now, given the situation of, say, poverty and unemployment, suppose the government gets elected and says, I'm interested in creating as many jobs as I can, that is the ultimate goal, and let the growth rate be a derivative of the policies, not the objective. Would that make any difference? How would you react to these two?
Well, there are a number of interesting questions that you have raised while you were this thing. I will not go into those now, but if there is time, I will talk about it. When I talk about property rights, actually it comes from the story, which Mansell Olson talks about. Okay? Now, Mansell Olson, I've been talking here. Mansell Olson's story is that in early 20th century, China was infested with roving bandits. And when you have roving bandits, nothing is certain about it. And, there was no incentive for saving, incentive for investment, incentive for growth. And there was a notorious bandit called White Wolf, which Fen Kusiang kills and tells the people that, I will prevent other roving bandits from coming in, but you have to give a constant share of your income to me. So from roving banditry, you move into a stationary bandit. From anarchy, you move into dictatorship. Now that fellow's incentive, however, is, there will be incentive for saving, investment and growth, but that is not encompassing because he has no interest in the poor. Now, one of the most important incentive for growth that he creates is that he protects life and property of the people and basically enforces contracts because it's in his interest to do that. So protects contracts, and in that process I am talking about the property right. Now you are right that it could be more nuanced, but then I am basically talking about a public good. After all, this is a public good which has to be provided by the government. Your security guard is not going to do this. So that's the reason why I want, in order to tell people what a public good is, which is non-rival in consumption and non-excludable, this particular thing was brought in. Anyway, that's the story. The second issue that we talk about is fiscal policy and growth. Now there is a lot of this thing that the government should create growth. Government should create employment. Now, but how do you increase the size? You increase the cake size. Possibly, you need to create conditions where more investment take place, more growth take place, and more employment take place. You can direct that through a particular policy package in order to have more labor-intensive growth. But government cannot create, something like, 2 million jobs every month. I mean, it's not possible, you don't have the money. I mean, therefore, fiscal policy has to be used in order to ensure that there is sufficient incentive for people to make investment and take care of the poor. Obviously, that is the reason why I talk about expenditure. Now, there is one more thing I want to mention. Where is the money for all these? And that's the question. Now, if you really look at it very carefully in your tax system itself, the number of incentives that you provide, at least some econometric analysis you have done. Now, somebody, Bhanumurthy will do something else and then he will produce something this thing. But the point is, 115 country analysis which we have done using alternative model gives me a tax GDP ratio of about 19.5%. Now you are generating only 16%. So from 16 to 19.5% with the existing system. Now that's one thing. And the subsidies on account of food and fertilizers. In fact, you see the type of iron power. See the free power that is given in Punjab is more than the eligibility, is more than 3% of GST. More than, or even for that matter, Tamil Nadu. So there is a whole lot of thing about rationalizing the expenditure and reallocating the expenditure. There is a whole lot of scope for, so I do say that the total public expenditure is not adequate. We need certain areas where we need to leave more. And finally, on the, local thing, I'm not going to touch with everything. Local body thing. There is a birth defect in the 73rd and 74th Constitution amendment. The birth defect is as follows. You create Schedule 11 and Schedule 12 in the Constitution and say that these are indicative lists which the state government may, at its discretion, devolve to the local bodies, urban and rural and urban. They can also devolve something else. Then why do you have that list at all? Number one. Number two, it also has in the Constitution you have union list, state list, and concurrent list. Entry number 5 in the state list says the responsibility for the rural, for the self-government is that of the state. Now, if there is a responsibility is that of the state government, which means that for everything you have to go to the state government and get it approved. But where is 73rd and 74th Amendment? What does it mean? And again, one of the most important things is, in most of the countries you see, much of the sources of growth comes from urban areas. In fact, Richard Byrd, who insisted that my name should come in the paper first. He's one of the top guys. Unfortunately, he's no more. Some 4-5 months ago he passed away. Just a few days before we had exchanged. But anyway, now, when the point is that he says that the urban areas is the focus of almost 50% in many of the countries. But urban areas can't do it because first of all, their property taxes, that's a major source of revenue. Where is the property tax coming? First of all, they themselves are not interested because, one of the major problems is that in the country, unlike in the case of companies, when they don't do well, they go bankrupt. Governments don't go bankrupt. Somebody bails them out. So, obviously you suffer substandard levels of services, and because they don't raise the revenue. And in the literature they say, oh, there is a great deal of necessity for revenue expenditure linkage, Victorian linkage is important, etc., etc. But anyway, unfortunately, unless and until you separately give recognition to urban local bodies and rural bodies as, with a separate list of revenue handles and then expenditure functions, specified for them, it's not going to, the things are not going to work. Some states will do a little more, some states will not do less, and then governor is supposed to appoint a finance commission, state finance commission every 5 years, and governor doesn't do it. Anyway, there is a lot of work that is being done. Sorry.
Yeah. I would also like you to take up 2 or 3 points that Professor Bhanumurthy raised, and this is regarding the FRBM roadmap and his talk about the flexible inflation targeting regime vis-a-vis having a fixed rule for the FRBM. And the second thing that he talked about was, the finance commissions working at loggerheads. So at loggerheads with each other, the 14th and the 15th. So you are again talking of having another institution, which is the fiscal institution. So when you have these institutions and multiple institutions, in fact, Finance Commission being one kind of an institution working at loggerheads, how do you prevent these kind of developments?
First one was...
was regarding the FRBM roadmap.
Okay. Now, I think, my good friend Banu didn't tell the whole story. He told only the half story. As it is in the FRBM Act, there is a 0.5% flexibility when there are this thing. That's one thing. There is some flexibility. But more than that, this particular item was referred to the NKC committee. The term of reference to the NKC committee on the FRBM Act was to see whether we need to have the fixed targeting or flexible targeting. Then it said that fixed targeting is the more appropriate thing and flexible targeting need not be there. However, it said that when the economy, if there is a 20, some percentage point decline, successive decline in the 2 quarters, you can increase the, there is some flexibility is given. It is not such a big band like 2 to 6%, but then there is some amount of flexibility given there. What is the second one?
Regarding the finance commissions working at...
Now, finance 14th and 13th, finance commission 14th and 15th didn't work at cross purposes. No. As Bhanumurthy said, over a period of time things have changed, but the point is, even 15th Finance Commission term of reference said that please look at, 14th Finance Commission was unduly, generous, and then please look at, take that into account. The Finance Commission, this is one of the ways in which the Government of India tries to nudge the Finance Commission to do it. And it is for the Finance Commission to take an independent stand on that, because now there is, but then by and large, what is the, if you really look at the main mandate of the Finance Commission, Article 280, the term of reference is given in the Article 280, which is distribution of the taxes of the center, and and the interstate distribution among the states. Number 2, grants in aid of revenue to the states. Number 3, measures to augment the consolidated fund of the state to supplement the resources of local bodies based on the recommendation of the state finance commissions. And 4th, any other matter in the interest of finance. Under any other matter, the Government of India has a habit of loading the any other matter. Your FRBM, debt limit, all these things come from there. Expenditure efficiency, what you do for GST compensation, all these things are referred. Whatever the Government of India cannot do itself, it just refers to the Finance Commission to get its views. And then it doesn't implement. But first, A, B and C, they generally, there is a tradition of implementing. Now, one of the things that they have said is that, Finance Commission could have objected to some of the things that they have said. They said that you just see whether the revenue deficit grant should be given at all. And these people have basically gave the revenue deficit target, but phased it out after 5 years in their recommendation. This is one of the things that have happened. But on the major recommendation, there hasn't been any sort of it has continued. I mean, I asked N.K. Singh, because N.K. Singh wanted me to be an advisor to the 15th Finance Commission as well, sort of. N.K. Singh asked me, then I said, look, I mean, there is no 32% to 42%, it is only a figment of imagination, and I explained to him. And incidentally, N.K. Singh was one of those persons who said Maastricht Treaty was the thing. I had to tell him that in the meeting of the 15th Commission, I had to tell him that please read the relevant portions in 12th Finance Commission, and he took it in good spirit anyway. So, 32% was the earlier Finance Commission, the 13th. 6.5% was the plan grant given separately earlier. That has become a part of the Finance Commission's recommendation. So 32 plus 6.5 becomes 38.5. And then the 14th Finance Commission said, we will not give any specific purpose grant, apart from the ones which are required. What the 13th Finance Commission had done is 100 crores for a medical college in Haryana, 154 crores for a lake rejuvenation in Karnataka, 150 crores for temple rejuvenation in Tamil Nadu, and like this there were about 75 grants that they had given. We said we don't have the expertise to do that, we will not do that. And they did not give separate grant for environment because we subsumed it in the tax devolution formula. So money saved that account was about 1.5. So almost 40% was, even if you take the previous commission. And these people understood it. And the 15th Finance Commission actually from 42% they made it 41%, where that 1% was for, was the cost of Jammu and Kashmir, which became a union territory. That's the thing. So by and large there were no differences. And on the institutions, I explained in very detail. See, the point simply is when the markets fail, governments have to intervene. What do you do when the governments fail? I ask this question. You need systems and institutions to protect against the government failure. Because when the governments fail, they don't go bankrupt, as I said. So you need to have that. Now, one of the major problems is that the problem starts with the projections, wrong projections they do. Then they are monitoring the fiscal targets they don't do during the course of the year. And finally, every other politician comes up and, in power comes up and say that, I will do this. He goes on making, the Prime Minister goes on the Red Fort and then gives a lot of promises. And nobody works out the details of what it costs to the country. What are the things that have to be done? So in order to do this monitoring, both at the central and state level, we said we need a fiscal council. This is similar to, you can say that, Controller and Auditor General, he does it post-mortem. This is concurrent. And this has to be going to the Parliament for discussion. And this is similar to Congressional Budget Office in the US, but Office of Budget and Accountability in UK, Parliamentary Budget Offices in other places, and basically that. The difference that we made was, initially 13th Finance Commission made some recommendation on that. But then it was funny. They said the Ministry of Finance will appoint a committee which will convert itself into a fiscal council. If Ministry of Finance has to do it, you are basically asking a player to be the umpire. I mean, obviously it can't be an independent commission. And then, I had criticized that in various articles that I read. So we insisted, in fact, I personally wrote a big note, before the decision was taken, and we said, you amend the FRBM Act, and after FRBM Act is amended, basically to have this commission reporting to the Parliament every 6 months and publishing it for a wider discussion. It's like this. FRBM, was it a success? Qualified, yes. Why do I say qualified? At least, the persons who want to do it, will try to say that, there is a FRBM and we need to report it, we need to control. I mean, it's not a full success, it is a qualified thing. Now, similarly, in other words, even here, at least reporting, some people withdraw, some people comment. Now, if the government has the political willingness, you don't need it. If the government doesn't have a political, political willingness, even if you have it, it may not work. Most of the countries which have it, it has been a successful. There is a very detailed review by IMF, which basically does this. So at least let us try that. So when NK Singh committee also came up with that finance ministry appointing a fiscal council, then in the meeting of the advisory council, I said that what are you trying to do? I mean, this doesn't work that way. Then he said, there was a member from IMF, that Anup Singh. Anup Singh, he was earlier worked in IMF. He said that what Govind said is right, and eventually that prevailed. They also said the same thing. The fact of the matter is, government doesn't want to accept it.